Hi all, Rick here with an observation. Is the 32nd century as we see it in Discovery and Academy actually advanced enough? Sure, it's been enough time to have the Jem'Hadar freed from Dominion control, Vulcan to reunify with Romulus, and all crazy time travel has come to an end. But what about the tech itself? We've seen some time ships and the like, Agent Daniels and other glimpses into future treks. How do these compare to the far future? The most notable feature of starships from the 32nd century is the fact that they're kind of in pieces. So exactly how this all works has not been revealed in the lore, but we can assume it's something a little more advanced than tractor beams or magnets. This also applies to the fact that somehow energy can be transferred between the segments. So I'm assuming quantum shenanigans. Now, this kind of thing was actually proposed for the USS Enterprise J, potentially as seen in Star Trek Enterprise. However, the idea was postponed in favour of the extra spindly nacelle pylons. This was to suggest that material tech had developed to such an extent, by the 26th century, that the beams should look too thin and impossible to our modern day brains. So audiences looking at the J would go, "That's way too narrow, too delicate." And the same is true for the 32nd century, complete lack of attachments. Another big example we can look at is the usage of warp drive. While warp effects are varied among the shows, from the flashy movie era effects to the standard warp particles of the TNG era and a myriad of other styles, the warp effect of the 32nd century has this horizon line across the field which is not present in the prior series of Discovery, which I take to mean that there was a new form of advanced warping effect. We also don't get any reveals as to what warp factors they're using, so let's just look at the trajectory of warp that we can see. We know that 9.975 was the maximum speed of the Intrepid class, and although it could maintain high warp for a long time, this was not possible to keep up. However, in 2382 we saw the Federation making use of the proto-drive on the Protostar and the first quantum slipstream drive-enabled starship, the USS Dauntless. Both fell under Admiral Janeway's purview and were in experimental stages, but seemed to be more than promising as downright functional vessels. Following on from this, we have the Pathfinder class active in the 2400s, which Beta Canon states also featured a quantum slipstream drive. By this era, vessels could make a jump to warp 9.99, a feat considered incredibly taxing only 30 years or so earlier. But while impressive and not a maintainable factor, it was considered routine for starships. By the time of the far, far future, well, we don't know, we don't get speeds listed. However, we are aware that they have alternatives to warp in common use, such as the QSD and Protowarp, and even a new one known as the Pathway Drive, which is still in development. However, thanks to the lack of definitive speeds, at least in comparison to the other series, it's impossible to say if warp has evolved far enough. It does look like it though, with AFAPD speeds. As fast as plot demands. What about starship firepower? Well, one thing I will commend is that a single torpedo from Earth did enough damage to shatter the shields of a 23rd century starship and deal a decent amount of kinetic damage to the vessel. However, they're still mentioned to be photon torpedoes, when we know there are far more powerful variations, like transphasic or even quantum. So while I believe the firepower is far higher, in reality they could have been pushed further. Of course, it's also hard to see if you imagine shield tech has also improved to weather hardier blows, so really we only get the one instance of comparison with an older vessel. So definitely more powerful, but it kind of still feels like they're pulling punches. Alright, so moving away from starships now, let's look at the more handheld level, the Tricom badge. This device is an evolution of the Com badge, which already featured as a locator, translator and short-range subspace communicator. This already was a miniaturized version of the TOS communicator, which did many of the same things. So continuing that compacting of tech, the new badge also houses a tricorder, holographic projector and personal transporter. That is a lot of tech in this little badge, so let's take a look at that path of development. The hollow emitter was already small by the 29th century, as seen in the Doctor's emitter, so if something like that could contain all the knowledge of the unique EMH, then it could probably contain all the info needed to replicate a pad or tricorder. Right, so what about all the transporting they do? Transporting is done so matter-of-factly and with such speed, it's borderline magical. The emergency transporter unit, featured in Star Trek Nemesis, was able to conduct a single short-range beaming and was a prototype in 2379. So give it another 800 years, and I don't see why this tech would not be far more commonly employed, especially when it's likely tied into the main systems of the host starship. The only thing I'm unclear on is how it reads the person's intended destination with such accuracy. The only way I can think of is that it involves mind reading, which, to be fair, the original Universal Translator in TOS could manage. Now, the criticism here is that while we saw them all over the place in Discovery, they were more lacking in the Academy in favour of traditional tactile pads, which I understand it is more interesting to see than waving your hands in the air. But with the prevalence of the tech, surely it should have been everywhere in the Federation. Next up, I want to draw attention to the replicator arches and transporter clothing beams that can recreate things in an instant, which is actually a really powerful system if you think about it. The arches of Starfleet Academy and the general starship transporters of the 32nd century both show the ability to change hairstyles and clothing while in use. Sounds useful, but consider what that means. The system is able to scan a person, all their clothing and appearance, selectively remove pieces, then use a replicator technology to recreate new attire in an instant and replace it. The fact it can cut hair shows that it's possible to do this to organic matter, and yeah, transporters got even scarier. So you can also point out that biofilters always did something similar, and that a transporter chief could actually disarm and remove dangerous components mid-transport. So altering the pattern was always a potentiality. It's just now an automated instant speed system. Now my criticism is that we don't get to see this implemented far more. Why shave and groom? Just arch it. Why get dressed in the mornings? Just arch it. So I think this tech could have gone further. The final item I'm looking at is programmable matter. This substance seems to need to be specially produced, with Starfleet seemingly able to have a near monopoly on its use. At least it is considered harder to come by beyond Federation borders. A lot of their handheld tech is now crafted from programmable matter. With the away team bracelet able to literally replicate and forge a phaser out of stored energy or presumably a number of other devices, it is commonly used to make repairs, as it can be manipulated to form any component, and even used as interface material. It is so common within Starfleet, in fact, that it's even used to coat rooms, allowing for the creation of tables, walkways, lighting, and so on. Frankly, it's kinda hard to pin down exactly how ubiquitous it is, because once it's in a shape, it could resemble anything. So is it feasible? Well, the levels we see in Star Trek are about 2 chapters beyond what is currently considered theoretical at this time, and I mean in real life. It's an avenue of development, mainly in computing, but the term is sort of an umbrella word for any matter that can be influenced by imparting information. One thing I'm going to excuse is any form of temporal technology, as that all reached its peak in the early 31st century after 500 years of temporal war issues, and that's not even counting the smaller incursions across the entire timeline, just the origin of most of the factions involved. At the climax of these events, temporal weaponry and time travel was simply outlawed, with most agreeing to abide by the treaty, having had more than enough of the threat to their very timelines. So weapons like the Aeon's subatomic disruptor may or may not be illegal now. Unclear if it relied on timey-wimey stuff. Now overall, I think the tech of the 32nd century is pretty much on par with what I'd expect to see, but only in some aspects. The ease of transporters, and the advancements in holography mostly. While by this stage I think travel times are pretty much hand-waved away with more believability than, say, Enterprise to Picard times. Other tech seems to not be as prevalent as you may expect, especially around the series of Starfleet Academy, where it felt like much of the crazy devices were not present on the Athena, at least in the same quantity as previously seen. So what do you think? Is it as advanced enough for you? Or is there any sort of tech that you would have expected to have reached insane levels by now? Thanks for watching. I've been Rick, and I'll see you later. Goodbye.